no coincidence that that testimony was given or those songs were sung, is that's exactly where the Spirit of the Lord has us in John chapter 5. I invite you to turn there with me this morning. John chapter 5, the story where Jesus heals the man that is crippled, the man that is paralyzed, the man that is lame in his legs and his feet, had been so for 38 years. He's healed on the Sabbath. And the Jews, the religious leaders of the day, they confront Jesus. Begin to criticize him and for breaking what they thought, breaking one of the commandments of God, or so they thought. Jesus' response was such an amazing thing. We're going to look at them this morning. He not only proves that he was not breaking God's commandment, that it's God himself that is at work. He proves that he's not breaking God's commandment, but God himself is at work. If you're able to this morning, please stand. Begin reading at verse 15. The man went away. The man that was healed. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. This was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. Because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Let's pray. Father, I pray this morning that you would grant us insight into these words that your Son spoke to these Jewish leaders. Lord, their notions of who you were as God, their conception of who you were as God, that led in direct contrast, was in opposition to who Jesus was saying that he was. Rather than receiving his testimony, they hated him all the more and sought to kill him, to get rid of the message that he was speaking. Lord, help us to understand what it was that he said in his words that would cause such a response as they wanted to put him to death. Lord, help us to see these things this morning, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Verse 17, Jesus says, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." Sometimes the English gets in the way of what the original language is trying to tell us. What the original language, if you lived in that day, just a common person living in that day, when you would have heard Jesus speak these words, he would have said something more like this. My Father is at work at this very moment. It's my Father who is actually breaking the Sabbath. Don't you understand that I'm so perfectly united with Him in spirit that because He is working, I am working? That's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is proclaiming Himself to be equal with and so perfectly united with the Father that He is making a direct statement to the religious leaders. I am God. That's what He's saying in His response. And if you read ahead, you understand that they understood exactly what He was saying. That's how we know it is the correct translation, because they understood it in verse 18. This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill Him. Because not only was He breaking the Sabbath, but He was even calling God His own Father, making Himself equal with God. They confronted Him. Why are you breaking one of the 10 Commandments? And He says, because I am God. Period. Now we as children understand that kind of talk. You grew up in a household where you asked your mom, you asked your dad, why are they doing whatever it is they're doing? And they tell you, because I can, because I'm dad, because I'm mom, and I have the authority to do so. End of story. Or put another way, when a child says, Daddy, how come I can't do that? And what's Daddy say? Because I said so. Why are you breaking the Sabbath? And He says, because I am God. And then He goes on to explain, I'm not really breaking the Sabbath. You don't understand who I am. Your conception of who I am is not big enough to understand why we have a Sabbath and what my role in the Sabbath is. I'm not breaking the Sabbath. I'm God. And the Father is the one that is here working on the Sabbath. The very God that these religious people are trying to follow. They are trying to follow rules and regulations in order to have a closer relationship with God. Do you see the irony here? They're trying to follow what they think God's Word says. They're following a misinterpretation of God's own law in order to try to get closer to Him. And yet God, the Father, is the one working, and they don't see it. They're blinded by religion. They're blinded by legalism. Following a set of rules does not get you closer to God. And Jesus is saying, it is the Father that is at work here. And I am so perfectly united with Him. And I was from eternity past. From the beginning of time. Don't you understand? There was never a time that the Father and I were not together. And He's working, so I'm working.